Well, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at all the A series that Google has ever made and pretty much see how they compare. Now, I will definitely tell you, in my opinion, I loved Google's stock Android offering. I love their Pixels, I love their Nexuses, and what's very interesting is I think Google sent me out all these phones except for this one. I did buy this one, which is interesting because this was probably my most favorite one they ever made. Now, it's weird they hid the screen timeout over here, but what's very, very crazy is it all started with the Google Pixel 3a, but right now we're on the Google Pixel 6a. And we have the 3A, 4A, 5A, and 6A. So you can just see the evolution that Google made when they originally made these devices. Now with the Pixel 3A, this was a very interesting device. They made two different ones. They made the 5A, they made the 3A, and they made the 3A XL. Now they did do the 4A and 4A 5G, but that's a little bit different. And this one originally came out in 2019. And when you actually take a look at this phone, the biggest thing and the craziest thing I think at the time was the display. They put an OLED display on a phone that I believe was like $329 or $349. So it wasn't really that expensive. You can buy these things very cheap nowadays. It was pretty much built completely out of plastic. It wasn't the most premium thing ever made, but when you look at this thing, it still looks very beautiful. And I kind of do think Google made a really good thing and made really big design choice with keeping the same design pretty much as the Pixel 3 for the most part. Then with the Pixel 4a, in my opinion, this was probably my favorite A device that Google has ever made. I think this one is probably the most impactful one as well. When you go from a 3a to the 4a, this one coming out in 2020, and this one had a hole punch display, 5.8 inch, 1080p panel, compared to the place. Compared to everyone back in 2020 though, this was a very good offering, especially when you compared it to the Galaxy, probably some Galaxy A series, but especially the iPhone SE2. This was a crazy offering. Stock Android, fingerprint sensor on the back just like this one, decent camera on the back as well. It felt just like it didn't feel like, I would say the Pixel 3a felt better, but this one still feels pretty good for being like a $349 phone. Then Google went ahead and made the Pixel 5a. Now this one was a little bit different. It was a little bit of a bigger device, which personally I think was cool and everything. It was pretty good. This one coming out last year, but the weird thing was that they didn't make a smaller phone. The 3a and 4a were so much smaller, and this one had a fairly large 6.34-inch display. Still 1080p, still a whole bunch display, but it was very interesting that Google went ahead and made just one device with this type of size, rather than making a 4A and like a 4A 5G or a 3A and a 3A XL. The camera setup on the back also I think was the biggest offering this phone brought besides its bigger size. The dual camera setup on this phone too, which really was good. But then we have the 6A. Now, I think out of all the ones so far, this one is probably the biggest leap and probably the best one they've ever made. However, you do have to remember that going from a 3A, this one was like $349, $349, it was around the $300 price tag, then to $349, then to $449, to this one being $449 as well. There is a steady price increase, so I don't want you to get the assumption that the 3A is the same price as this one when it first came out. The 3A was not. The 3A was a little bit cheaper, so definitely keep that in mind. Now with the 6A, I think this is the best one Google's made, and if they just keep down the same road, I mean, it's crazy to me that they made a phone like this. This one has a 6.1-inch display, so it's a little bit smaller than the Pixel 5a, but it's a 1080p panel hole punch display, but the hole punch is now centered, but also the feeling of this phone just feels so premium. One of the worst things, and kind of going from all the phones, the 3a, it was a good feeling phone back in 2019, but now when you feel it, it definitely feels like a cheaper device. I don't want to give the impression that it was like such a cheap phone in general or anything like that, but when you look at both these phones, I mean, you can definitely tell the 3A doesn't look as premium or look as crazy as the Pixel 6a. You do have plastic sides all across with the 3A as well, where the 6a definitely has this, aluminum build, but also with the front, as I mentioned before, this is the biggest thing. With the Pixel 3a, you got a lot of bezel around it, but you have to remember that the flagship of that time, which was also the Pixel 3, had a lot of bezel. Even like the Pixel 4 kind of had some decent amount of bezel in the chin up top. Personally, I think this was a cool thing that Google did at this time, and it didn't really look that super outdated. But then when you look at the Pixel 6a, it's cool that Google made a phone like this, in my opinion. But then it takes us to the Pixel 4a, which personally I think this has been a really good approach from Google for making a phone like this. I mean, this arguably was a better phone than the Pixel 4, in my opinion, although the Pixel 4 is faster, better display, and everything like this. When you look at them on the front, there seems to be less differences here. The Pixel 6a hole punch display in the center is definitely a bigger phone on the 6a, squared off edges on this one, but the entire phone of the Pixel 6a is completely built out of aluminum, where the 4a is built out of plastic and it doesn't really feel like a premium device, but it wasn't going for a premium device, so you do have to keep that in mind. If we're talking about strictly like which one is the more expensive feeling one, of course the 6A is going to be better, but it's also a little bit more of an expensive device, so keep that in mind. On the back though, we had the single camera setup on the Pixel 4a. The 6A had a dual camera setup, and I will definitely tell you the camera setup on the 6A is pretty good for it being as cheap as it is. We also had a glass back on the 6A, where we had the plastic back on the 4A. My only complaint of the 4A when I used it, it wasn't the performance, it wasn't the battery life, it wasn't the camera, it was actually the feeling of it, to be honest. I just didn't like how cheap it felt, but I think it's understandable when you consider how cheap this phone was at the time. Then what Google ended up doing with the Pixel 5a, which there were rumors that they weren't even going to drop it for the most part, they ended up actually going through and giving us a bigger phone, which I think it's an interesting thing. I don't think they had to make it a bigger phone, but they decided to, which was very interesting. But the biggest takeaway I think with the Pixel 5a was the camera. They went ahead and gave us a dual camera setup on the back of their A series of device, and it was a ultra wide sensor. Now, it really wasn't I don't think it was the same camera as the Pixel 5, but to give you some perspective with the Pixel 4, they put a telephoto lens on that, and everyone did not like that. They put an ultra-wide sensor here on their A series, which was much cheaper than their Pixel 4 and 4 XL, and people actually like this camera a lot. And personally, I think it was a good approach from Google as well, like I mentioned before. The fingerprint sensor on the back of the Pixel 5a with the fingerprint sensor on the 6a is, embedded in the display. The phone also feels pretty good on the Pixel 5a. I think this is almost primarily built out of aluminum, but the 6a definitely feels like a much better feeling phone. I've kind of said that too many times in this video. And on the front, I will say one little edge that I kind of liked about the Pixel 5a is the kind of round edges, but I also kind of like the squared off edges on the Pixel 6a. I think both of them look pretty good for the most part. It kind of just depends on which one you kind of prefer. Personally, I think both these look pretty good. I don't know if there's a winner here, but if I'm being honest, when I look at the Pixel A series in general, I look at the Pixel 5a, I look at the Pixel 5a, I look at the Pixel 4a up here, and I look at the Pixel 3a, I think each iteration of devices brought something really interesting to the table to lead us now into this specific spot. With the Pixel 3a, they gave us the A series in general, a cheaper phone, two different sizes. It was pretty similar to the Pixel 3 at the time, which was the flagship. Then Google ended up making the Pixel 4a, which I think was one of the best choices they've ever made. This was a very solid upgrade coming from the Pixel 3a, and this, in my opinion, kind of saved Google in the year of 2020. Then they ended up coming back with the Google Pixel 5a, which I don't think really too many people were super stoked about. I think this was a really good phone for the most part, but I think most people were just kind of, I don't know, there were so many other phones in 2021, and this one it just kind of came and went. I also don't think Google hyped up this phone too much either, so there's also that. But I think this was a decent phone, but it was not as impactful as the 4a. And now with the 6a, I think this is very similar to the 4a. I think the 3a was super impactful, the 4a was super impactful, 5a not so much, and then with the 6a, this is a completely different story. They've pretty much gave us a, almost like a flagship phone without having to spend on that flagship price. Now, this is, I would say, more in line to a flagship than any of these other phones. This is definitely the best A-series Google phone, Google's ever made. But this makes me really excited about the future of the A-series. If they can keep the price tag at $449, I would hate to be in a situation where this phone we've already seen a price increase year after year after, pretty much not year after year. These two were around the same, and these two are pretty much the same. But if these end up being $499 and then $529 and then $599, then it really makes no sense to even have an A series at that point, because it's just going to be super expensive phones all throughout. So that's kind of how all these phones kind of compare to one another. I would love to hear your thoughts about this in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.